That night changed everything for me in a way I could never have imagined. I thought our family trip would be filled with the usual laughter, tired feet from sightseeing, and the simple comfort of being together. But one evening, my son surprised me in a way that left me speechless, beyond words, really. It wasn't about gifts or grand gestures. It was something far deeper, something that touched a part of me I didn't even know was waiting to be reached. Before I tell you exactly what happened, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments below. It always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. Our trip began like many family trips do, messy, chaotic, but sweet in its own way. I had been the one to plan it, of course, because mothers rarely stop organizing no matter how old their children get. My son Daniel is grown now. At 30, he has his own life, his own routines, but when he suggested we take a short trip together, just the two of us, I said yes faster than I probably should have. Maybe I wanted a piece of the closeness we had when he was little, before the world called him away. We chose a small mountain town, tucked away from the usual noise of the city. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the streets were lined with quaint little shops that felt like they had been there for generations. I loved the way the early morning sun filtered through the tall trees, throwing long golden rays across the cabins where we stayed. Daniel had grown into such a strong, thoughtful man, but in my eyes, there was always that little boy who once held my hand so tightly when crossing the street. Traveling with him reminded me of that. The first few days were filled with long walks on winding trails, dinners in rustic restaurants, and moments of laughter when we got lost trying to follow maps that seemed more like puzzles than guides. One evening after dinner, we decided to sit outside the cabin where we were staying. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, and the night sky above us was filled with more stars than I'd seen in years. Daniel had brought out a blanket and draped it over my shoulders, the same way his father used to. That small gesture nearly undid me. It was tender, unexpected, and filled with an unspoken understanding. We sat there quietly for a while, sipping on hot tea, the crackling fire from the cabin fireplace faintly audible through the open door. I found myself watching him in the glow of the lantern we'd set on the wooden porch. His profile was sharp, his eyes focused on the horizon, as though he was lost in thoughts I couldn't reach. There was something in his silence, something heavier than just relaxation. "Daniel," I finally asked softly, "what's on your mind?" He turned to me slowly, his expression gentle but serious. And then he said something I will never forget. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't expected. It came from a place deep within him. His words poured out, halting at first, then flowing as though they had been waiting for the right night, the right stars, the right silence. I sat there, stunned, my heart caught between pride and an ache so deep I wasn't sure what to do with it. His voice was filled with emotion, and for once I didn't try to interrupt or fill the quiet spaces. I just listened, the way a mother should, but also the way a woman listens when she realizes her child is no longer just hers, but a person standing fully in their own truth. The way the night wrapped around us, the way the stars seemed to lean in closer, I felt as though time itself had paused to give us this moment. It was unexpected, it was tender, and it was real in a way that left me forever changed. And as I sat there, my tea forgotten, the blanket still draped over my shoulders, I realized this trip was never about sightseeing or relaxation. It was about something else entirely, something that had been waiting quietly to unfold until the right night brought it into the open. When Daniel's words settled into the night air, I felt my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. I had braced myself for something simple, a passing thought about his work, maybe even some worry about money or the future. But what he said reached deeper. He told me he had been carrying a sense of distance, not just from me, but from life itself. That even with all his accomplishments, something inside him still longed for connection. And then he looked at me in that soft, unguarded way that only a child, even a grown one, can look at his mother. "I didn't want to tell you before," he said quietly, "because I didn't want you to worry. But lately, I've been thinking a lot about what really matters. I feel like I've been chasing things that don't fill me the way I thought they would. And being here with you, it reminds me of something I've missed." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I couldn't speak. My mind raced back through the years. His childhood, the long nights I stayed awake worrying about his fevers, the teenage years when we argued about curfews, the day he left for college with a suitcase in one hand and his whole life waiting in the other. In that instant, I realized he wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about us, about the bond we had let grow quiet, not broken, but buried under time and independence. I reached out and placed my hand over his. His fingers twitched, then closed around mine, strong and sure. The warmth of his hand startled me, not because it was unfamiliar, but because I had almost forgotten what it felt like to hold him this way. For years, physical closeness had been replaced with phone calls and short visits. Now it was as if that distance evaporated. The stars seemed brighter above us, the night air sharper, alive. I thought about all the times I had wished he would let me in, wished he would open his heart. And now, here he was, doing exactly that. My heart swelled with gratitude and a kind of sorrow. Too, sorrow for the years when I thought maybe he didn't need me anymore. "I know what you mean," I whispered. "Life has a way of making us believe the wrong things matter most. But you've always mattered. You'll always matter." His eyes glistened as he nodded, and I knew he understood. We sat in silence after that, hand in hand, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. A silence heavy with love, with unspoken forgiveness for lost years, with the quiet promise of something new. The next day, something shifted between us. I could feel it in the way we moved through our little routines. Breakfast wasn't rushed. We lingered over coffee, letting conversations stretch longer than they needed to. On our walk through the trails, he slowed his pace to match mine, and when I teased him about it, he just smiled and said, "I like it better this way." Later, we visited a small local bookstore, its wooden shelves bending under the weight of forgotten novels and poetry collections. Daniel picked up an old book of essays and handed it to me, saying, "This reminds me of you. You've always loved words that dig a little deeper." I laughed, touched, and slipped the book under my arm, like it was a gift meant only for me. But it was that evening, on our second night at the cabin, when the weight of it all truly hit me. We cooked dinner together, nothing fancy, just pasta and vegetables, but it felt different. Every movement was unhurried, every glance filled with something more than routine. He asked me questions about my past, about moments I hadn't thought of in years, and he listened as though every word was precious. At one point, while stirring the sauce, I caught his eyes watching me, and I realized just how present he was. Not distracted by his phone, not lost in the worries of work or the future, just there. And in his gaze, I saw the man he had become, but also the son who still carried my love in the deepest part of him. That night, we sat again on the porch. The air was cooler, and we wrapped ourselves in the same blanket as before. He leaned back against the wooden railing, exhaling slowly. "Mom," he said, his voice steady this time, "I don't say this enough, but I want you to know. You're the reason I am who I am. Not just because you raised me, but because you've always been there, even when I didn't realize I needed it." I swallowed hard, the tears stinging before I could stop them. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't answer. So I did what I hadn't done in years. I leaned my head against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't shift or resist. He just let me rest there, his arm coming up slowly to hold me. It was unexpected, it was tender, and it was everything I hadn't known I needed. The trip was beginning to feel less like an escape and more like a return, to him, to myself, to something sacred we had always shared, but sometimes forgotten. And in that closeness, under the glow of the stars, I realized the best surprises in life aren't the ones that dazzle us for a moment, but the ones that quietly transform us forever. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong just outside the cabin window. The air smelled crisp, carrying that faint earthy scent only mountain mornings seem to have. Daniel was already up. I could hear the faint rattle of dishes in the small kitchen. For a moment, I lay there listening. It struck me how rare it was to wake up and not feel the usual rush. No appointments, no phone calls, no emails demanding attention. Just quiet, and my son moving gently around the kitchen, as though he wanted to let me sleep a little longer. When I finally stepped out, he turned and smiled. "Coffee's ready," he said, holding out a steaming mug like it was some priceless treasure. I couldn't help but laugh. Somehow, that simple gesture, seeing him take care of me, felt like the world had shifted a little. He wasn't just my boy anymore. He was a man who carried kindness in the way he moved through life. We decided to spend the day exploring a lake we'd heard about from a local shopkeeper. The path leading there was long but beautiful, lined with towering evergreens that whispered as the wind moved through them. The sunlight filtered through in patches, lighting up the moss on the rocks and the wildflowers peeking through the underbrush. Daniel walked beside me the whole way, matching my pace, occasionally pointing out a bird or a shape in the clouds that caught his attention. It reminded me of when he was small and saw the world with endless wonder. The lake, when we reached it, was breathtaking. Its surface shimmered like glass, reflecting the mountains that cradled it on all sides. We sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, pulling off our shoes and dipping our toes in the cool water. For a while, we just sat there in silence, letting the beauty of it wash over us. I glanced at him, watching the way his shoulders relaxed, the way the sunlight softened his features, and I thought, this moment right here is worth more than all the years of worry, all the sleepless nights. It was then that he began to talk again. Not in the hesitant, careful way he had the first night, but with a flow that surprised me. He told me about moments in his life I hadn't known about, times when he had struggled silently, when he felt lost in his choices, when he wished he had called me but didn't. He admitted there were nights he sat in his apartment, feeling the weight of loneliness, but convinced himself that reaching out to me would only make him seem weak. I listened, my heart aching and swelling all at once. I wanted to stop him, to tell him he never needed to hide from me, that I would have taken his calls at 2 a.m. without hesitation. But I knew he needed to say it, to release those words into the open air, to finally share what had stayed locked inside him for so long. At one point, his voice grew quiet. "I guess I just didn't want you to see me as anything less than strong," he said, staring at the lake. "You've always been so steady, Mom. I wanted to be that too for you." I reached over and touched his arm gently. "Strength isn't about never falling," I whispered. "It's about letting someone help you up when you do. And I would have been there every single time. I still will." He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see something shift in his eyes. A softening, an opening. He smiled, not the practiced smile he often wore in front of others, but one that came from somewhere deeper. We stayed at the lake longer than we planned, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the mountains. On the walk back, Daniel told me he felt lighter, like a weight had lifted just by sharing those words. I told him I felt the same, though in truth, what I felt was more than relief. It was a quiet joy, the kind that settles deep in your bones. Back at the cabin, as night fell, we lit a small fire outside. The air was cooler than before, and we pulled the blanket tighter around us. He leaned back, looking at the stars. "This trip," he said softly, "it's not what I expected. I thought it would just be a break, a chance to get away. But it's more than that. It feels like I found something I didn't know I was missing." I knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't just about the place or the time away from everyday life. It was about rediscovery, about realizing that bonds, no matter how worn by time, could be renewed and even strengthened. I watched him as the firelight flickered across his face, and I felt gratitude swell inside me. Gratitude for this trip, for this moment, for the unexpected turn that had led us here. And I realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that we were not just mother and son sitting side by side. We were two souls meeting again, seeing each other clearly, and finding comfort in that recognition. That night, before I went to sleep, I stood by the window of the cabin, looking out at the dark outlines of the trees against the starlit sky. My heart was full, my mind quiet. I whispered a silent thank you to the universe for giving me this time, for reminding me that even when life feels like it's rushing past, it can slow down long enough for us to remember what truly matters. I didn't know then that the most powerful part of this journey still awaited us, that the deepest surprise was yet to come, and that it would change the way I saw both my son and myself forever. The last day of our trip arrived more quickly than I wanted. I woke up early, before the sun had even begun to rise, and sat quietly by the cabin window. The world outside was still dark, the forest hushed except for the distant call of an owl. My chest felt heavy with the realization that our time here was nearly over. I didn't want to leave, not the cabin, not the mountains, and certainly not the closeness Daniel and I had found again. When he stirred awake a little later, he found me still sitting there. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, his voice husky with sleep. I shook my head. "Didn't want to waste a minute," I replied with a faint smile. He came over, sat beside me, and for a while we just watched as the first rays of light pushed their way through the trees. The golden glow crept across the forest floor, and I thought to myself how much it resembled what I was feeling inside, light breaking through the shadows of distance and time. We decided to take one last walk before packing up. The trail was damp from the night air, the leaves glistening with dew. The air carried that sweet, clean scent that only mornings in the mountains can hold. Daniel walked slightly ahead, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders relaxed. Watching him, I couldn't help but think about the boy he had been, the boy who once clung to my hand and looked up to me for answers. Now he was a man finding his own, yet still letting me walk beside him. Halfway down the path, he stopped and turned toward me. His expression was serious, almost nervous. "Mom," he began, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." I thought about saying it the first night, but I wasn't ready. I think now I am. My heart skipped. I braced myself, uncertain of what he would say, but ready to receive it. He drew a deep breath. For a long time, I thought I had to keep certain parts of myself hidden, not just from you, but from everyone. I didn't want to disappoint you or make you feel like you hadn't raised me right. But being here, being with you, it reminded me that love doesn't come with conditions. So I want you to know me, really know me. The way he said it, the honesty in his voice, made my eyes sting with tears. He shared truths about his struggles, his fears, the moments he doubted himself. He admitted that he sometimes felt lost in the life he had built, chasing expectations that weren't his own. And then he looked at me, his eyes steady. I was afraid to tell you because I thought maybe you'd see me differently. But I realize now, if anyone could understand me fully, it would be you. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and placed it against his cheek. Daniel, I whispered, there is nothing you could ever tell me that would make me love you less. Nothing. You are my son, but you are also your own man, and I am so proud of who you are, even the parts you think are imperfect. His shoulders dropped, as though he had just put down a weight he'd been carrying for years. He pulled me into an embrace, and I felt the strength of him, the warmth of him. It wasn't just a hug. It was a release, a renewal. I held on tightly, knowing I was holding not just my son, but the man he had become, the man who had chosen to trust me with his deepest truths. The rest of the day moved gently. We packed, cleaned the cabin, and shared one last simple meal together. But everything felt different. There was a new ease between us, an honesty that hadn't been there before. We laughed freely, spoke openly, and even in the quiet moments, there was comfort. On the drive home, the road wound down through valleys and fields, the scenery rolling past like a living painting. I glanced at Daniel from time to time, watching the way he focused on the road, the occasional smile that played at his lips. And I thought to myself, this trip had been more than just a getaway. It had been a turning point. That night, after I returned to my own home, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, reflecting on everything. The unexpected turn of our trip hadn't been about where we went or what we did. It had been about the words spoken, the walls lowered, the love rediscovered. My son had surprised me beyond words, not with a gift or a gesture, but with his heart, with his truth. And in giving me that, he gave me something I will carry for the rest of my life, the reminder that no matter how old our children get, no matter how far they go, there is always room to reconnect, to rediscover, to love more deeply than before. As I set my tea down and looked out at the night sky, I whispered a prayer of thanks. For the mountains, for the stars, for the courage it took my son to share himself with me, and for the bond between us that had grown not weaker with time, but stronger, richer, and infinitely more beautiful. Our trip had ended, but what we gained in those few days would last a lifetime.